So I think that, the thing that went wrong, if you like, is it became a function of the marketing department, which I don't think it should ever be. It always struck me during the pandemic, business as usual ceased. Loads of companies were like, what do we do? Our business model is, ostensibly finished, or at least on hold for a long time. What do we do? And the companies that the organizations that knew what to do were those with a sense of purpose. They had the roadmap, if you like, had been torn up, scrunched into a ball, thrown out the window. But what they had, because they had a sense of purpose, was a kind of compass that said, this is helps us make the right decisions now. So I still think it's massively relevant. I just think we have to sort of understand its place in the hype cycle. Now that the great wave has come in and receded, what beautiful things, what's left on the beach for us to pick up.
So hello, my name's Joe Morrison, and today I'm really fortunate that we have with us Reuben Turner from Rewild Creative. Hello, Reuben, welcome.
Hi.
Can you just tell us very briefly a little bit about Rewild and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Rewild is my creative consultancy. After several decades working in creative agencies and being a agency founder and a creative director and an exec creative, all of those things, really, it was time for me to think differently about being able to apply creativity to problems, really, social problems, business problems, in a different way. And so Rewild was born, really, and the insight or the inspiration came out of this notion that actually in the process of rewilding, which obviously a lot of people started to do on land, unexpected things happen, and strange synergies arise, and you don't always get to do that in the confines of a typical agency brief. So that's what I've been doing, and it seems to have worked quite well.
That you rewilded yourself.
That's where I started, basically. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I love the idea of the unintended, the unplanned for things. And you're right, that is the spring of creativity often. Something that I know you've got great knowledge and wisdom about, and it's brilliant that we can share this today with other people in other companies and organizations, and they can take this stuff on. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about your experience. It'd be great to hear, what things you've learned in your journey. Reuben, can you tell us about why we should care about purpose? Now, this is a topic that gets talked about an awful lot, but I know, because I've known you a long time, I know you've got more experience than most people in this field. So tell us, with all this conversation about purpose, why should we care about it?
It's such a resonant question, and purpose seems to have sort of fallen off the hype cycle, and I think it's very telling that I think purpose got caught up in the world of marketing. We are marketers, and marketers get very excited about things and tend to decide that whatever hammer they're holding in their hands is turning everything into a nail. So, and we've seen that, recently with the metaverse and AI and, crypto, and there'll be another one along next year. And purpose, unfortunately, kind of got caught up in that and was kind of given as a panacea for everything. So I think that, the thing that went wrong, if you like, is it became a function of the marketing department, which I don't think it should ever be. But I think where it's really valuable and why we should care about it is it can bring a real galvanizing force to companies, to company founders, to boards, to people who are coming to work there. And that can be really essential and really make the difference, in becoming sort of a core part of an organization's culture, a higher order benefit, a higher meaning to why they do what they do. And where we saw that, I think, it always struck me during the pandemic. I don't know if you can cast your mind back, it's a tricky, what is it, 4 years ago, pretty much now, wasn't it? We had this moment where business as usual ceased. Loads of companies were like, what do we do? Our business model is, ostensibly finished, or at least on hold for a long time. What do we do? And the companies that the organizations that knew what to do were those with a sense of purpose. They had the roadmap, if you like, had been torn up, scrunched into a ball, thrown out the window. But what they had, because they had a sense of purpose, was a kind of compass that said, this is helps us make the right decisions now. And I think it's that, really. I think purpose can sit at the heart of a business to help guide decision making, help guide products, help guide partnerships, help drive culture, and do all of those things. And marketing is kind of like the last place, really, actually, sometimes where it should be seen. So I still think it's massively relevant. I just think we have to sort of understand its place in the hype cycle. Now that the great wave has come in and receded, what beautiful things, what's left on the beach for us to pick up and take forward. So I think it's still hugely valuable. It still has to be done authentically, can still bring great kind of meaning to companies, to founders, to boards, to the people that work there and the decisions that they make, I guess. That's how I see it.
So on a day-to-day basis, it helps with, as you say, culture and giving people direction. But then when uncertainty happens and when you've got a real problem and something out of the day-to-day happens, that's when it really comes into its own.
And let's face it, we are living in a world that is more and more uncertain all the time. So, we've had the knocks of COVID, we've had the knocks of the Ukraine war, which, hugely shook up the business world, of behavior change, and climate will be the ultimate, disruptor, I believe, of the everyday, if you like, and of our certainty. And those organizations that are ready to embrace uncertainty and change, not exploit it, but embrace it and be ready, be resilient, having a strong sense of purpose is really going to help them do that.
The question I really want to ask you about is, what is the secret of a great creative brief? So if somebody wants to get the best out of an agency, or maybe even people internally, or a freelancer, what's from your perspective as a creative consultant and someone who's been a long experienced creative director, what is it what's the brief that you want that actually will get the best out of you?
Yeah, it's such an important question, actually, because we all spend ages looking at creativity, judging, creative work, having feelings about it, but we spend far too little time actually looking at where it came from, what originates it. And a great brief, really does make all the difference. And I think it's interesting that the world of briefs is changing. So if you look at a lot of old school or traditional agencies and planners, they're still writing briefs, as though it was a brief for like a 48-sheet poster for Silk Cut. Do you know what I mean? They're still looking for that elegant, perfect proposition, that boiled down, that sort of reduction. I'm not sure that is really relevant anymore. So I think the two things that feel really important, in a great brief now, are asking the right question, I think, is number one. And what you tend to find is a lot of briefs ask the same question as every other brief, and the brief before them and the brief after them, which tends to be, how can we increase sales? How can we inspire group X to do thing Y? But it's the briefs that dig into that, and start to ask a different question that get better and more interesting results. So, there's loads of examples of that. One of my favorites is that the Sainsbury's try something new today, which is sort of recognized as one of the most successful, effective campaigns of all time. But they asked a different question. They stopped asking the question, how can we get people who don't want to come to our supermarket to come to our supermarket? And they asked the question, how can we get every single person that comes to the supermarket to spend an extra £1? And that's a fundamentally different, change the nature of the conversation. So I think getting to that really good question is fundamental. The second thing I think is really important is it's a lot looser and it's a lot harder to define, but it's basically getting to a shared place of what you think good looks like, what you think great looks like. And often that's about tone, and often that's about sharing examples. So I've sat in great creative briefings where there's been more pictures than words, actually, and there's been more really good examples of interesting stuff from that sector, other sectors, which are like, this is the kind of thing we aspire to, and here's why, or this is the kind of thing that our audience is into, and here's why. And that, I think, you know, we've got to remember that creative people think in pictures as well as words, you know, and bringing the subject to life like that, I think can be really, really helpful. So spending some time doing that, I think, is great, you know. So those are the two things, I think, is getting the question right, doing that really hard work to go, are we just asking the same question that every other brief is doing? And then doing that, building that shared sense with your creatives, you know, of what good looks like. So you kind of really in the right space, like emotionally and tonally. Is
Right,
that a
thank
useful
you.
answer? I hope
Yeah,
so.
it is. And I
Hopefully
think I
that's
like
useful.
this idea of getting into the, getting into the mindset of the creative. What is it that they need and what will
Yeah.
inspire them? And I think reframing the question is a great thought to build on, because you're right, so much of what we do year after year is asking the same question. And if you want to
Yeah.
be different, then you need to ask a different question to get a different output.
And in that Sainsbury's example, they thought about it from the point of view of the punter. They didn't think, how can we get more profit into Sainsbury's? They thought, through the punter's eyes, what does that look like? And I think you're right in briefing, thinking about what the creatives need to do great work, because actually quite often briefs are written with a different audience in mind. They're written with the client in mind, with the strategist in mind, with the person who's signing it off in mind. Actually, really, you know, challenging ourselves to say, what does this creative person need to inspire them, to excite them to be spending all of their waking hours, whether you're paying for it or not, on this brief? You know, what's going to get them thinking about it in the shower, on the toilet, on the bus? You know, like that's the stuff you need to be thinking about, because it's where great ideas happen.
Now, another question I'm really like burning to ask you is about how do you avoid the dilution of great creative ideas? So I've definitely seen this problem time and time again over the years, where someone comes up with a concept or an idea that feels brave but also a bit daunting. So in your experience, how can those ideas be protected and nurtured and allowed to flourish without being watered down so the original thread is completely lost?
And I mean, you've seen it plenty of times. You can imagine how many times I've seen it, you know. And actually, as a creative director, that becomes like a huge part of the job, is landing ideas so that they survive, you know. Anisha Kotecha, I used to work with a lot, you know, had this phrase, baby lions are easy to kill, you know, you've got to let them grow up into big lions so they can defend themselves. But actually, as lion cubs, they're easy to get rid of, you know, bit grim. Yeah, so it's you know, they're a very fragile state. So I think a couple of things happen. Is one, what happens is the ideas have to be able to fend for themselves within an organization, so they have to be ready to be presented on, talked about without you in the room, socialized, you know, kind of moved around, like consulted with. And that means they need to come with great rationale, so you're empowering at every stage the person that you're talking to with what they need to do to explain that idea really well. Do you know what I mean? You
Yeah,
can't just
yeah.
put it on a board and send it off into the world. It has to come with that protection of that, the rationale, the brief, the insight around it, so that it can that it can survive that process. Basically, it can survive in the wild, if you like. So, and then I think the other thing that always really, really helps is just go back to the brief, and more importantly, maybe go back to the insight. What's the thing? What was the moment where you were like, that idea, this is like why this is a great idea, and package that up all the time in the storytelling, you know, so that it stays with it. The other thing I think is really helpful is kind of making it somebody's problem, you know, because quite often what happens with agency people, or you know, or freelancers or any creative people, it's like, wow, we're excited about that, that's our thing, we hand it over, and then the internal process of selling it, moving it around, socializing it, it becomes like, oh, that's what the agency says, you know. So I think actually having a team in the room that buy into it collectively and all agree that they're going to own this thing and look after it, is really, really good. But yeah, it's one of those things that you know, it's vital skill, and it's the thing I'm still learning about all the time. But that's a couple of things from my experience that help.
I think it is such a skill, and you know when people can do it really well, there's probably nothing more valuable because it is ultimately what is going to make you stand out in the market, right? So you
And I
need
think
to be able to.
we've all been through that process where you start with a great idea and then what comes out the other end of the machine is unrecognizable, and it's a thing that actually nobody loves anymore.
Yeah.
So you've started with something that somebody loves and maybe somebody else has questions about, but you end up with a thing that nobody likes. And actually that's the thing, to avoid, is to be able to keep coming back and go, remember why we're doing this and what it was that got us to this point. And that's still right. So this is still right.
I like what you said as well about almost coming back to the epiphany moment. This is where this idea sprang from. And if you can kind of recapture that excitement and also the logic of it as well, then it makes sense to kind of promote that moment and use it to
And,
present.
and also, I think being brave enough sometimes when an idea is going off track to say, does this idea still work anymore? Is it still true to what we agreed at the beginning? And are we now doing something that anybody actually wants to do anymore? Is it time to take a step back and relook at it all? Because I think, yeah, a lot of the time, as I say, stuff comes out the other end that nobody really loves, and that shouldn't happen.
But it does.
It does.
Now, Reuben, I want to talk to you about creativity in partnerships. So, you've been involved in some big and some surprising partnerships over the years, and I'd like to ask you, like, how can we think differently about who we seek to partner with and how we make those partnerships work that can be especially effective?
Yeah, I think I've been involved in a few things over the years. Often often in the charity sector, it's to do with finding corporate partners and vice versa. So they're finding an organisation, and what we've seen there over the years is that there's a sort of transactional element to that, which kind of fails to deliver on its promise. So where it's just a kind of an exchange of money, um, in exchange for some brand assets, I think that's a real shame, and it's a real lack. So I think the great thing about partnerships is to do that thing where you identify a problem that you can solve together, that you can both bring something to, that the other partner can't, and then you work out how that's going to work, and how you're going to align values wise, how you're going to work together really well. So a lot of organizations that do that really, really well. I'm thinking about things like the Samaritan's partnership with I think Network Rail, to tackle suicides on the rail, and you just think about that, as a really powerful thing. I think NSPCC partnering with, I think it was O2, on safety for young people using mobile phones. That's a great partnership. It's not about money, it's about going, we both own part of this problem and together we can fix it. So I think those are really good. And then I think increasingly what happens in the world, I mean, I'm really interested in the world of fashion, and actually what happens in the world of fashion, those brand partnerships are really fascinating, where they're sometimes incredibly unexpected, but they're more to do in a way with art and
Mm.
reframing your brand in a kind of a new light. So I think those things are really exciting, and I think other organizations could learn from those. They're more creative, they're more unexpected. Actually, what they're more about in a way is hype and getting eyeballs on something, but I think that can be really exciting. So, one of the ones I'm thinking about, there's millions in that world, and there's millions of sort of crappy product drops, but I really love, there's one where Balenciaga, the clothes brand, they did their catwalk show as an episode of The Simpsons. And I was just like, how unexpected and how brilliant when you've seen a catwalk show a million times, and the boringness of that, like over and over again, what's going to happen. But just like a genuinely creative partnership, which I think has kind of helped to reinvent both, in the minds of a different set of people. I thought it was kind of perfect. So yeah, I think it's that really. It's finding that genuine shared value, not monetary. Beyond that, finding something that's got room to be creative and grow, and do something that you could never have done on your own. I think that's the space to look for it. With values alignment, if you can get it.
Yeah, and I like the idea of thinking like you said there with The Simpsons, like thinking of almost like if you think really creatively about, well, if we partner with X or Y, that you would never normally consider, like what connections could we come up with Like if we had to partner with them, what would we do? And sometimes just thinking like that can just force those connections that once you look for them, that you can see them. But if you never even sort of put them in a picture, then you never come up with it.
This is where I find the world of fashion really interesting. Not that I have really worked in that space very much, and not that I particularly follow fashion. We'll say nothing about my, um, but but I just think it's an interesting world to learn from, because of the speed and the sort of hype cycle, but also their willingness to just take risks and kind of go be unexpected is what it's all about. And I just think, yeah, there's a lot to learn there.
Yeah, it's an artistic mindset in that industry, like you said. That's probably the key to it, isn't it? So Reuben, I'd like to ask you about, and this is something I've written about before, and I know you think about this, but the strategic value of creativity. So when we talk about creativity, there's often a kind of default mindset or go-to association, which is about, advertising and marketing, or even that kind of very visual, graphic design, these kind of like images that we have in our head. But I know that you're a strong believer in creativity needs to drive strategy and organizational strategy and business strategy. So can you talk about how you think that kind of bigger value can be unlocked? Like, how can we inject creativity into this aspect of business?
Yeah, I find this is a conversation that I have so often with creative leaders, creative teams, where there's a sort of an end of a funnel, and their job is to do the execution part effectively and on brand and creatively, and that's great, and they do it really well, but it becomes about a kind of efficiency. Whereas I think we're missing the value of creativity, which is sometimes to drive it upstream to enable the unexpected, to enable unexpected conversations and enable different things to happen. So I think there should be more room for creativity in the boardroom. I think, quite often, I mean, in charities and a lot of businesses, you would never you don't tend to find a creative leader at C-suite, which is a shame, because those skills of kind of problem solving, identifying different answers to questions, thinking deeply about and empathetically, with your audiences, all of those things I think are incredibly valuable, and actually also kind of sometimes just enabling the unexpected to happen. Going back to that rewilding analogy, just being able to sit there with a kind of completely different point of view. So I think I think it's incredibly valuable. And again, we saw it in the pandemic where people who were able to pivot and shift and think differently and think smartly about the problem they were facing versus people who shut up shop and sent everybody home, or did really did really bad things like laid off loads of their staff. You can imagine, you remember the kind of some of the terrible PR stories that were going around. So I think having creativity at a strategic level is really good, and how you build that. Yeah, I think it's giving creative leaders a seat at the table and listening to them, but also it's about enabling a creative culture. I think, where things are allowed to be talked about, and we learn from other. We train ourselves to look at creativity, to value it, to talk about it, to assess it, to judge it in our everyday conversations, where it's not something that's like we're only going to talk about, when it's at that executional level, but that we're looking out all the time into the world and asking what we can learn, from other kind of creative organizations.
I mean, even like when you said creativity in the boardroom, like instantly that feels like an uncomfortable collection of words put together. You know what I mean? It's like it's just not associated with that level of decision making, and I think that's such a shame. But I think you're right. Like the COVID pandemic is a really good point in time to look at. I've met so many entrepreneurs who tell me that the pandemic was the springboard for them. Like they found the opportunities in that moment. Like, so it is there. There is something connected, I think, with creative thinking and being agile and flexible. And like you say, what you said before about having a purpose that you could follow rather than kind of really rigid kind of way of working, which tends to be really kind of short-term sales driven, right? Oh, we've got a pandemic, we can't, we're not going to achieve the same sales, next week. What are we going to do? Rather than, thinking what can we do, and looking for new areas to find those answers.
Yeah, and just all those things like, you know, breweries and you know, perfume manufacturers that started making hand sanitizer, you know, just like thinking really differently, thinking, well, just because that's what we did last week doesn't mean it's what we have to do next week. And actually, what do people need? And I always felt that was a really creative question. And that's where I think I love your reaction to that, as it feeling quite uncomfortable, because I can't tell you the amount of times I've been sort of allowed into boardrooms, trustee meetings, senior, you know, things as like, here comes the creative. Oh, careful, what's he going to say? You know, and you're kind of like seen as a bit of a you are an outsider in those spaces, which is great, and you should be. But also just sometimes being able to ask those questions like, who cares? You know, does this actually matter? Will anybody really notice it? You know, those are the tough questions that creatives have to ask all the time, you know, when they're working on stuff. So actually bringing those questions further up, I think, is sometimes really good.
Yeah, it's a comfort with uncertainty, isn't it? And there's some mindsets who are like just really uncomfortable with uncertain paths, basically.
Yeah, I think that's another really good point, actually, that sometimes what we need to bring is not creativity or creative minds, but creative processes
Mm.
into the boardroom, where it's like, okay, well, let's work these problems out in a different way, you know, and treat it like a creative brief. I think that's, yeah, yeah, you've got a group of people there who are very good at sitting in front of a blank sheet of paper.
Reuben, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you today, and I'd like to have you share like all your vast experience and wisdom. Like I really appreciate it, and I know people watching this will appreciate that because you've had so much to share there on how we use creativity, how we think about it differently, and I think it's just and it's just always just fun to talk to you. You've always got so much great stuff to share and great examples as well. Really, really kind of rooting it in the real world, which is fantastic. So thank you very much. If you're a business owner or if you're an entrepreneur and you want more support or more advice on running a business, then you can find more content like this and more support at foundersreboot.com.
Great stuff. Thanks for having me on. It's been, you know, I could talk about creativity all day, so it's good. You've been able to kind of narrow it down a bit, which is really helpful. But yeah, it's been great to talk to you. Always a pleasure, Joe.
All right. Thank you, Reuben. Thanks so much.
All right, take care.